They're shooting part of the Captain America in here.
Asked the residents to support. It was specific for Atlanta. It was aimed at expanding our transit system within the city. And therefore, I think that the burden of transparency is higher than it is usually, which it should be quite high often. MARTA released a statement today saying that leaders are playing politics and delaying all of MARTA's improvement projects. The project will be implemented over the next 40 years.
All right, time now to turn and drive in Miami's South Beach area. One suspect is in custody. After all the violence over the weekend, Miami Beach officials imposed a curfew from midnight to 6 a.m. every night. The Atlanta City Council
Sunday, the Fed announced that it, alongside other central banks, would ramp up what are called swap operations. Those ensure a more consistent global flow of the U.S. dollar. The plan will be in place through April. Now, the move comes on the heels of increasing turmoil across the banking sector, both stateside and abroad. The central bank has even expanded its emergency lending program to help banks get through this tough moment. The Fed and other central banks are in a precarious position as it is. The COVID-19 pandemic caused an unprecedented and frankly unconventional economic disaster that made it difficult for just about any central bank or even government to tamper down. Inflation started to rise as the economy reopened. Demand outpaced supply in the early days of the recovery. That caused global supply chain shortages, and we're still dealing with the consequences today. In New York, I'm Eddie Hirschfeld.
10-year-old girl could lie to parents about a trip with a 31-year-old man. The senator is asking tech executives what their companies plan to do to protect children from the AI chatbots. Could more bank bailouts be coming? Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen today hinted at this at the American Bankers Association conference in D.C. She defended the Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank depositor bailouts, saying they were essential to safeguard the U.S. banking system, mentioning that a similar move could be on the horizon for other banks. Here's Yellen.
Our intervention was necessary to protect the broader U.S. banking system, and similar actions could be warranted if smaller institutions suffered deposit runs that pose the risk of contagion.
This appears to differ from her previous comments when she said those actions would only take place for banks whose failure could threaten the entire U.S. banking system. And more in the
ask you, President Biden, a historic moment in his presidency, his first veto on a bill that encompasses ESG, primarily for people's retirement plans. What is your initial reaction?
Well, it's disappointing to me that the president doesn't hear what Americans are saying. They want their retirement plans governed by material differences in the economy. They want our retirement plans to be safe, not governed by the types of environmental, social governance issues that President Biden and the woke Democrats keep bringing up.
In light of the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, do you find this to be a little bit more concerning than it otherwise might be?
Well, I've been talking to my colleagues on the House Financial Services Committee, and you can't legislate competency. And I think that's where this really comes down to. Everybody, is talking about how do we respond to SVB. I think when the dust settles, we're going to find that some regulators weren't doing their job. Here we had a bank that doubled in size in the last year. It went from $50 billion to $220 billion over the course of 2.5 years. It's an unconscionable amount of growth, and let's see what happens when regulators are in front of us answering the questions that I think the committee has.
In this term, ESG seems to have come out of nowhere in recent years. If you could just kind of unpack it for us and tell us what some of your concerns are with this specific policy.
Well, when you require companies, publicly traded companies, when you require retirement plan owners to essentially double down on renewables or make sure they're investing the right way according to your climate change priorities, whatever that may be. And the problem is, to your point, it means something different to a lot of different people. If social responsibility to one person is something different to another, how do you legislate that? And what's interesting about the SVB bank failure is they forgot the G. Where's the governance? Where's the board of directors in that bank collapse in Silicon Valley? So ESG means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and that's why it shouldn't be in our law.
Congressman Mike Flood, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me today.
Touch on things I've never heard anybody touch on. And I guess just introducing this, can you tell us kind of why you wanted to do this documentary? Why focus on black crime, and especially focusing on among the rap community in particular?
Sure, absolutely. So, and I'm glad to hear you say that we're touching on some things that you haven't really heard discussed before. The impetus for this project was the death of Takeoff a few months ago. He was a rapper in the group Migos. And it was just the latest in a string of killings of hip-hop artists over the years. So after that death, lots of questions were raised, and of course lots of conversations began about, once again, violence within black communities, violence within hip-hop, and people sort of exploring ways to figure out how to address those issues. A lot of times, we get into this in the video, these conversations happen, and then a few months later, things kind of go by, and we forget about those conversations, and everybody just kind of moves on, and it just keeps happening over and over again. So this project was designed to sort of keep a spotlight on it and try to shine a light on this issue and try to assess why this keeps happening and what is going on in these communities to where this is a regular occurrence, because this doesn't seem to happen to artists in any other genre. This isn't happening to house music producers. This isn't happening to rock stars. This seems to be an exclusively, by and large, black music phenomenon. So I will push back a little bit initially and say it's not a project about black on black crime. Black on black crime really isn't a thing. People victimize who they're closest to. Blacks victimize blacks at the exact same rate that whites victimize whites. So if we're going to say black on black crime, we need to have a conversation about white on white crime. Overall crime is just crime. You victimize who's closest to you. But I put together a panel of people who, frankly, are a lot smarter than me. And we took a look at this and conducted a series. Well, I had an interview with each of them that ran a very long time. So we got into a couple of overlapping themes in addressing this issue. We focused on families. We had conversations about political choices and progressive policies that have impacted these communities and brought them to the destabilized positions that they're in. We get into how neighborhoods have been destroyed, the actual music, and is it art imitating life or life imitating art? And we also got into some solutions on how to actually resolve this issue. So I think it's a productive piece. It runs about 80 minutes. I hope people tune in because, again, it's bringing together people who don't necessarily agree on every single point, just like in real life. But there are a lot of stakeholders on this issue. We're all impacted in some way when there's violence in any community, whether we want to admit it or not. So it's a pretty broad conversation that we have. We cover a lot of areas, and I think if you make it to the end, you're gonna see ways that individuals can start to make a difference in their own community, and we can start to tackle this issue and end some of this violence that's plaguing communities throughout the United States.
Yeah, speaking of the race issue, there's something really important that you brought up in this documentary, kind of more towards the beginning, which is that it kind of raises the question of, are we having the right conversations? We tend to view this as a black issue and not as an American. Well, I think more towards the middle you got to this, but we're not viewing this as an American issue. And this really brought up some of the questions, some of the discussions I see people having, especially among conservatives, where you have a lot of these anti-white narratives, white America, white people responsible for this and that. But it goes both ways, a lot of different ways, actually, where people tend to view problems in the black community as problems of the black community, and they don't view it as an American problem. Why did you choose to bring up that discussion? Because I actually really agree with you on that. We need to start viewing things not as one group or another, but as problems for us as a nation.
Yeah, that came up in the conversation on family structures in the nuclear family. Conservatives a lot of times like to focus on fatherless homes, and we often use this trope. 70% of black kids are fatherless, which is factually untrue. I mean, data's been out on that since 2013. The CDC releases information on it, which we get into in the video. But Rachel was making that point and saying that when it comes to the issue of fatherlessness, that number is closer to 50%. But it's not that it's just an exclusively black phenomenon. It also impacts Hispanics. It also impacts whites. It's just that blacks get hit first, and then everybody else gets hit later. So it's very limiting and reductive and unproductive to have a conversation that's focused on such a statistical falsehood and making it seem like it's just a black problem when really it is an American problem. And I think that, again, with this conversation, we can kind of open up dialogue a little bit more and have sort of a broader conversation.
By subsidizing, ways of doing things or bad choices and making it so they don't result in bad outcomes. And in a funny way, bad outcome can be something positive for society in some ways, where if a business cannot sell a product people want, it's going to fail. Is the solution then to subsidize that business to make sure it doesn't fail? Well, what you're going to end up with is a failed state if you're doing it at a broad enough level. You can look at fatherlessness, as we discussed earlier. Some of the programs, for example, supporting single mothers have incentivized that, and probably made it a lot worse, I'd say. I guess the question is then, to what extent should the government play these roles, and to what extent should the government not be involved in these things? And on that note, I guess, because so many of these progressive policies have focused on Black communities, what has the Black community learned from those types of policies that should be kind of a warning bell to all of us, as an American society overall? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the overarching theme that would sort of answer your question on the second half of that question would be that more government is never the answer. Again, to get out of this, I mean, it's going to have to be changed at the individual level. It's going to have to be bottom up, grassroots level, not top down. Top down is what got us into this. So we need to have this, we need to get over this reliance on the government to solve all of our problems and realize we're going to have to take action ourselves and start to resolve these issues without seeking a ton of interventions, particularly at the federal level, in dealing with these sort of things. And there are people who are on the ground doing the work. There are people doing the work in Chicago and St. Louis, and I would imagine New Orleans now is the murder capital of the entire United States right now. But that change has to come from the grassroots level.
Well, let's talk about that, because the grassroots stuff has two sides to it as well. I've met some really just amazing people who do like community outreach. A lot of actually former gang members, funny enough. Honestly, some of the best people I know are former gang members. People who went to the worst places a person can go and pull themselves out of it. Like, honestly, I mean, I have families and friends who are like that. Some of the best people you'll ever meet, who changed themselves, who were, in their own words, probably terrible people, but did a 180. And you find these people actually not only helping kids in ways that I think few other people can, but also I think having a level of respect from people, knowing that I was just like you. I had the same problems you did, and I changed myself. You have that level of it, right? When let's say you're dealing with these communities and they're looking at these two options, how do you contrast these things, and how do you balance which one is actually beneficial?
Well, so one of the things I noticed when I was going through footage for this, I mean, I dug back to the 1800s on some of this stuff. And
well, it goes back to the 1800s.
Well, yeah, and one of the things that I've seen is when it comes to this issue specifically of violence through music, this isn't a new phenomenon. I mean, you had voices back in the 80s and 90s who had entire movements around stopping the violence. So this problem has been persistent since that time. And it's going to take a big effort and a lot of honest conversations in order for us to make a dent in resolving this. One of the other questions that came up was just the issue of Black culture, and if this was an issue of art imitating life or life imitating art. And I think one of the things you'll probably see throughout the video is that there's a little bit of both, right? So when people are rapping in hip hop about in certain songs, right, whether you're talking about East Coast or West Coast, a lot of times what you're seeing is they're
Tupac and Biggie.
Yeah, they're describing their neighborhood. They're describing what they see. They're describing the political circumstances of the local communities. They're describing the issues that they're having with police. They're describing what's around them, right? When they're talking about the violence, they're talking about selling drugs and the violence they're seeing because that's what's happening in their neighborhood. On the flip side of that, a lot of kids are impressionable and don't necessarily understand that it is simply a representation of what's being seen, and it can be internalized And, that stream can go both ways. So you can't have it be art imitating life and also life imitating art. That's the conversation I think that needs to continue. By and large, in my opinion, it is people describing the things that they're seeing in their own neighborhood and expressing those things as a vehicle to put those ideas out and to bring about change. And the reason that we've seen the proliferation of a lot of these types of lyrics and music is because the problems never got addressed in the first place. The same problems some of these neighborhoods had back in the 1970s and 1980s, they still have today. And that's part of the reason that we see some of the political apathy that we see throughout the United States. It's like, why should we vote for you? Why should we vote for either party when no matter who we vote for, nothing ever changes? So there's a little bit of I don't want to say the word apathy, but there's a feeling of hopelessness throughout a lot of these areas. And I think that sort of fuels and drives more of the pathologies and behaviors that allow this cycle of violence and allow this cycle of change to never materialize for a lot of people. They're letting out rapists, they're letting out murderers who go back and re-terrorize their neighborhoods and keep wreaking havoc. We saw this in 2020, the George Floyd protests throughout the country. When they were burning buildings down, a lot of those buildings that got burnt down and got trashed were of Black business owners. So the people who say that they're for us are actually enacting the policies and engaging in the actions that have the most destructive impact on the community. So again, that it sort of comes back to and just brings back to the idea that this is going to have to happen at the local level from the bottom up with individuals making decisions to change, but those decisions are only going to be made once people sort of take more of an effort to become mentors and go in and show people a better way, show them how to do these things. If I came up to you and said, Josh, I want you to build an engine for your car, like your engine. If you don't know anything about cars, you're not gonna know where to start. You're gonna need somebody to show you a video, show you an engine, go through a couple things, show you which tools to use, and give you at least a foundation on how to do that for you to even have a fighting chance. And that's the thing. We're asking a lot of people to build a car engine without showing them what a wrench is.
What little boy hasn't slipped his foot in his mother's high heel just to see what it felt like? Does that mean he wants to be a girl? But if you've got people saying, yes, that's what it does mean. And what do you really think? And they're always pushing these ideals. Of course, a lot of children are going to be deceived by that. And that's why so many who have gone down that path end up severely depressed. Suicides are high in that population. And it's child abuse to actually subject a child to something like that.
Since you studied the brain so much, I'm just curious, at what point in the brain's development would you say it's appropriate for a human being to start making choices of that nature?
Well,
they are.
The brain does not mature until your mid-20s. So, an 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old is certainly not equipped to make those kinds of decisions. That's why they have parents to protect them, to guide them. And then you have these people who come in and psych out the parents, saying, you want to really have a child who's unhappy and grows up. And they psych the parents out. Parents have got to be smarter than this.
My final question, Dr. Carson, is do you ever plan to run for office again, and or would you serve in a future administration?
Well, I will always do what the Lord wants me to do, but I hope that's not it. I hope to be able to have an effect from the outside with programs like these. We have our Little Patriots program, which is really teaching the children the fundamentals of who we are as a nation and the real history, because your history is the basis of your identity, which is the basis of your beliefs. So we've got to get back and we've got to shore up all that stuff if we're going to succeed as a nation.
Thank you, Dr. Carson. As always, thank you for your faith, for your passion, and everything you're doing, especially with the American Cornerstone Institute. Thank you.
The chief executive of Stellantis' Dodge brand says at full throttle, the car could completely drain its tank of racing fuel in under 6 minutes. Now, the price tag is $96,000, and that doesn't include an almost $8,000 gas guzzler tax. Dodge is already working on a new fully electric muscle car, which is expected to be available in 2024. And that's all today from the NTD business team and myself, Don Ma. You can follow me on Twitter if you're there, and if you have any news tips or feedback for the show, you can email us at business@ntd.com.